Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. This is David Bianco. Today I'm going to be going back in time to the 70s to a product that isn't really made anymore. Like so many things, it had its day and it's come and gone. These are 4-channel or quadraphonic LPs. That's right, vinyl that gave us 4-channel. Now how could that be when there's only a groove with 2 walls on it? Well, we'll talk about that, and also I will share with you most of my quadraphonic collection. That's coming up next here on our Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. So multi-channel sound is something that we're all probably more familiar with now in this day and age because of the advent into it related to the movies. There's 5.1, which is a left and right front, a left and right rear, a center channel for dialogue mainly, and the 0.1 being a subwoofer connection. This has been evolved to even 7.1, 7.2, 9.2. There's Atmos, Dolby. There's many incarnations now. But back in the 70s, this concept of multi-channel or 4-channel or 4.0, which mean left and right front, left and right back, was brought to the record industry, to LPs. The problem with it was there were 3 competing standards or capabilities to get that sound out of a record. And as we know, when there's format wars, typically it gets ugly. Back in the days of videotape, it happened with Sony Betamax versus the JVC VHS. And VHS won mainly because it was able to hold longer times on tape. The actual visual quality of VHS was actually subpar to the Betamax, but the Betamax, it was a smaller physical case and it couldn't hold as much time. And the rest, as they say, is history, along with licensing issues, of course, Sony having more stringent licensing and JVC having more open licensing for VHS. Well, in the 70s, the 3 formats for the LP were SQ, QS, and those 2 were what were called matrix. And then there was a discrete capability of 4 channels called CD4. And you'll see that in my collection. One of the things about quad albums is many times the tracks on there sounded somewhat different than their stereo counterpart. That often was a matter of it being a different mix or even a different take that was used for the quadraphonic. Sometimes this was very interesting. Sometimes it was annoying because something really important was different in the 4-channel versus the 2-channel. So overall, it always wasn't a 1-to-1 match between the stereo and the quadraphonic releases. Quadraphonic releases also typically were $1 or $2 more per LP at the time. They also didn't necessarily always get released at the same time the album did. But the format really only lived from about 72 to 75, so it was relatively short-lived. In my collection, I'm going to show you what I have. We're going to start with Aerosmith's Toys in the Attic, which is a really good album on its own, but it even sounds better in quadraphonic. This was an SQ on Columbia. Really a good sounding record and very good mix for quadraphonic actually. The next one I'm going to show you is a different format and it's an America album. It's called Hearts, and you'll see the quadradisc in the corner there by the price. That meant CD4 for Warner Elektra Atlantic. Now this was the format that was the most difficult to get to play correctly because it required not a decoder like SQ and QS, but a demodulator. It also required a special cartridge to be able to play these with a Shibata stylus. And it also had to go to a very high frequency range. because these actually have a radio frequency signal at 30,000 hertz, which is used by the demodulator to separate those channels. Whereas in matrix, there's differences between the channels and some math basically that goes on in the decoder to simulate the back channels. This was actually giving you what was considered discrete 4-channel by having very distinct signals sent to each of the 4 channels. And it did sound good when it worked. But between that carrier signal being at 30,000 hertz and the cartridge having to go up to the 50,000 hertz range to decode this, the demodulators had to set carrier frequencies, which made it pretty complicated. So this was a very enjoyable situation when everything worked perfectly, plus it cost more in equipment to do CD4. And it was probably the format that was the best at 4-channel and the least likely to succeed. One of the things that was unique, of course, is you really kind of needed a separate disc even to test it out and to set your signals. So you can tell right out of the box that it required more attention. The SQ and QS played very naturally as it was, whereas these really required a special cartridge. You could play it with a regular cartridge, but you never were going to get it down in the groove far enough as was needed to get all of the signal out of it without that Shibata stylus. So CD4 was kind of in self-destruct mode from the beginning. An important fact to talk about is that part of the technology needed for a CD4 record to get made was half-speed mastering. Why? Well, it turns out in order to get that 30,000 hertz carrier signal onto the record, well, that had to be done at half speed in order to be 15,000 hertz. And then when it doubled, it got up to the 30,000, which is above our hearing level, of course, but was enough to trigger the carrier signal needed to demodulate the 4 channels into a true 4-channel sound field. Some more records here in the A's. I had Art Garfunkel with his first debut album with the single on there, All I Know, and his second album, which I really love this album, Breakaway. These were Columbia SQs as well, and this one actually is a gold stamp promo. Next, I have one that's pretty coveted. It's Black Sabbath Paranoid, 4-channel. Sounds very unique. A lot of great guitar riffs are isolated or moving all over. Some of the more tricky type of things that are done here. My friend Robert Fithen got one of these in a collection recently and was talking about how it sounded different and what some of the differences were. This was a CD4 quadradisc. So again, it had to have all those settings right. But when it sounds right, it sounds great. By the way, this just came out recently on what's called a Quadio multi-channel disc by Rhino, and it really sounds great there. You don't have to have any special settings or anything. But for old time's sake, that one's great to have. Another Columbia SQ, Tyranny and Mutants by Blue Oyster Cult in quad. Bread was CD4 quadradisc on Warner Electro Atlantic, Baby I'ma Want You. Bread really sounded good in quad because of the way their instrumentation was done. And the best of Bread also on CD4. A&M Records was unique because they did both SQ and CD4, and you never knew which one it was going to be. This Carpenter's Horizon album is actually a quad CD4. But their greatest hits at the time, the singles, was SQ. So A&M was kind of tricky. Columbia, again, back with a Columbia release, Chase, the band Chase. It was a horn-type band. They had a hit called Get It On. That LP was an SQ. And then we get to some Chicago records on Columbia. We have, of course, the first one, Chicago Transit Authority. And this is a SQ quadraphonic. Sounds very, very good. The second album came out in Quadraphonic also, Chicago 2. This is Chicago 5. I got this actually in Europe. It's got that unique little logo there in the corner, the gold one, which was done on European releases. And my last Chicago one was Chicago 9, or their greatest hits. These really sound good with the Chicago group because of all of the horn sections and the instrumentation kind of spread out and giving some airiness to that musicality of their band. Next up, we have the debut album of David Gates, the lead singer of Bread. His first album called First, and this was a quadradisc on Elektra. His follow-up album was Never Let Her Go, and it also was a quadradisc Elektra album as well. So that required that demodulation CD4 cartridge with a Shibata stylus on it. Tony Orlando and Dawn's Greatest Hits. This was on Arista, and Arista used CD4, so this required the decoding as well. Next up, we have our good buddies, the Doobie Brothers. Love the Doobie Brothers. Several of these albums came out. They all were on CD4 because they were Warner Brothers. We have Toulouse Street, which was their debut album. Actually, it was their second album. It was really a debut in terms of popularity. We have The Captain and Me, one of my favorite albums of theirs. I did a shootout on this one actually recently, and this is a CD4 version. What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits. This is a CD4 that had Black Water on it. And the last one they had on quad was called Stampede. And again, these are all CD4s because they're on Warner. Next we have The Doors and their greatest hits. This was a unique album because this particular record was only released on Quadraphonic with the songs that are on here. I have several of these. Actually, I gave a copy to Wyoming Dave because I thought he'd enjoy it, and I think he did. It's a great album in terms of the content that's on it, and it's uniquely available in Quadraphonic, this particular set of songs that are on this. The other Best of the Doors that came out similar to this was in fact had some different tracks on it. They later on did make a stereo version of this album that had a similar cover on it, but it wasn't 4-channel. So this was a unique record when it came out because it was the only Best of the Doors that existed. And I can tell you, the Doors music really does accommodate 4-channel very well. It sounds really great with separation. Again, another one of these. So I've had several of those. I kind of grab them when I see them. We have Bob Dylan Desire. This is SQ, and this is a Columbia. Obviously, all of his stuff pretty much is Columbia. And that's a great album on Quadraphonic. Then we get into the Eagles. And I shouldn't say the Eagles. It's actually Eagles. One of These Nights is a Quadraphonic. Here's one where they actually took the regular cover and just put a sticker over it that went over the spine as well to indicate a different catalog number. Usually they were stamped on the cover individually with a different cover, but that one was not. Whereas like this one on the border, you can see it has its own unique quadradisc and CD4 indicator, so it has a new cover. So Eagles sound very, very good in Quadraphonic, as do the band Earth, Wind and Fire with That's the Way of the World. This was a Columbia Quadraphonic SQ record, or Matrix 4-channel. Very good sounding. And we have Eric Carmen, Greatest Hits. This was the lead singer, of course, of the Raspberries. He also had his own one-hit wonder, All By Myself. And this was on Arista, so CD4 for that one. Eric Clapton, and this is on RSO, which is part of Warner Elektra Atlantic, 461 Ocean Boulevard, CD4 recording. And we have the Grassroots, one of my favorite bands of the 60s. Their 16 greatest hits. Now, this is on ABC Command Quadraphonic. You'll see some more of those shortly. ABC Command Quadraphonic used QS, which was a Sansui developed system, which was a matrix type of 4-channel, and it was decoded. It was also called RM, or regular matrix. And this one really I looked for years. Couldn't find it. The songs are mixed a little different, which makes it unique. I ended up finding this in a peculiar way. I was at a store in Indiana, I recall this so well, and I was looking for this album, and they had a pretty big quadraphonic section in this store. And I went looking in there, and I actually found a few records that were quads, but not this one. This was always on my wish list, my want list. And so I went and found their regular grassroots section, and it wasn't in there as well, which it shouldn't have been. It's a quad. And then I went to their below the shelf bins on the floor and went down to the G's. And lo and behold, what's sitting in there was this record, the quad version of it. So I had looked for it in all the normal places, and then it was down there. Now, ironically, it was $20, which a lot of the records down below there were much less than that because they were the ones that weren't as popular and what have you. Somehow this one snuck down there, and $20, whatever it was, I think I'd have paid probably twice that to have it because I had looked for it for so long. Really a good quad album, and I really enjoy the fact that some of these mixes are slightly different. I'm really a big fan of the Grassroots. Okay, the next one up is Harry Nilsson Schmilsson album. This is on RCA. It's a quadradisc, which means CD4. RCA was exclusively CD4, as was Warner Elektra Atlantic. The next one is Isaac Hayes, the soundtrack to Shaft. So this one was a bit of a sleeper because you really wouldn't know it was quad, except it has this sticker on the side here that's in red that basically tells you that it's quadraphonic. And this is a QS, or the Sansui matrix, like the ABC records are. Next up is another quadradisc, Volunteers by Jefferson Airplane. And Jefferson Starship had one for the Red Octopus album. This had the hit Miracles on it. This, of course, is again a CD4 quadradisc, needing the demodulation capabilities. As is Jethro Tull Aqualung. This is a Warner Elektra Atlantic, so it's CD4 as well. And another one that they had was War Child. This is another quadradisc CD4 from Jethro Tull. Now I have several from Jim Croce, and these are all ABC Command Quadraphonic or QS. You don't mess around with Jim. Greatest Hits, The Photographs and Memories. I've got a name. ABC Quadraphonic there. And lastly, Life and Times by Jim Croce, quadradisc. Joni Mitchell, being on Warner Elektra Atlantic, has a quadradisc of Court and Spark. This is a very well done CD4 record. Sounds very good. As well as one of her other releases, which is a double LP, and it is called The Hissing of Summer Lawns by Joni Mitchell. This is, again, a cutout, which is a unique one for being quad. But this one was a gold label stamp promo of that album on quadradisc. Loggins and Messina, their self-titled album, and they also did Full Sail. I've got that somewhere, but I didn't see it in the stack for some reason. But I've got a couple copies of this one. This one had different catalog numbers on it for some reason. It had a CQ31748 and a PCQ31748. They had some oddities of cataloging at CBS back in the day. And Nectar. This is a prog rock group. And these are really, it's funny, these do not say particularly that they are quad by any big logo or anything. It just says on the back that it was processed. And this one was QS, and this one, ironically, was SQ. So a little bit of a weirdness there. Nectar is a really good prog rock band if you've never heard of them. And again, those albums are in fact only released in quadraphonic format. Next are a couple of my Pride and Joy quads. This is a German copy of Dark Side of the Moon in quadraphonic. Now, Alan Parsons actually mixed this album originally to be quadraphonic and then mixed down to stereo. A lot of people don't realize this. There were quite a few of these that were released when the album came out in quadraphonic, mainly outside of the United States, of course. And the German one is one of the better quad pressings in terms of quality. So this is one of those never sell albums in my collection, as is this next one, which is the U.S. Columbia quadraphonic of Wish You Were Here. These both really sound excellent in terms of the effects that come out of being in quad. It's SQ matrix, so it sounds good on a regular old stereo as well, of course. But once you turn on that decoder for SQ, it really opens things up. So these really are enjoyable, and I've had those since they came out in the 70s with their release. Here's another Columbia one. It's one of Poco's albums in quadraphonic. Another great one, actually, in quad, the greatest hits of Santana. And their music, as you know, is very dynamic, and it has an excellent sound to it in general, but you can imagine how much more you get out of it with all of the percussion that's going on in these back channels surrounding you. So this is really one to have if you like Santana. Seals and Crofts, I've got a couple of these. Diamond Girl, which was probably their biggest album that launched them with the Diamond Girl song. They had Summer Breeze and an LP before this, but this kind of solidified them back in the 70s. That's a CD4 Warner's release with Quadradisc, and then another one they had called Unborn Child, which was released about a year later than Diamond Girl. Paul Simon, his debut album in quad on SQ with Columbia, of course. Really excellent sounding quad album, as is Simon & Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Really spacious sounding track, Bridge Over Troubled Waters, you might imagine, when you have it in surround. Carly Simon, one of my favorite female artists. I really like her a lot. And her Best Of album has all the best songs on there, and they are in CD4 discrete quad. And this sounds really, really excellent when the demodulation is set right and everything's going right with this. It sounds excellent. This is a band, Southern Hillman Fury Band, kind of guys that left other bands getting together and putting an album out. A little bit of a countryish rock kind of thing, a little Eagle-ish kind of album on Quadradisc. So this is a CD4. Now we're getting into some of my other favorites. Can't Buy a Thrill, Steely Dan, ABC Command Quadraphonic, QS Matrix 4-channel. This has some different sounding mixes of the songs than is on the stereo version, and it's a good sounding record from the spaciousness of it. It isn't quite as crisp as the regular stereo release. It's a little muddier in places, but it is an interesting listen, if nothing else. Countdown to Ecstasy is much more normalized to the stereo version, doesn't use a lot of different mixes on it, and it sounds wonderful in QS. The same is to be said for Pretzel Logic, which was their last release on quad. These three are the only three that were released on LP quad. Now, they were released in other ways in, I believe, 5.1 and more of the digital media, but in fact, these were the only three that came out on LP. In the home stretch of what I have left, we have Cat Stevens' Foreigner on A&M Records, SQ. Like I said, they did some in SQ and some in QS, but this one was an SQ release, the Matrix channel, 4-channel capability. Electronic music, Tomita, Japanese fellow who did a lot of interesting music back in the 70s. This is a quadradisc RCA, so it's the CD4 format. And this is pictures at an exhibition. These really sound excellent. They really have a lot of very distinct separation on them from Tomita. And I really enjoyed what he had done. He also had one called Snowflakes Are Dancing, quadradisc as well. So that's kind of my electronic foray. Synergy, this is a prog rock band, and this is on Passport Records. This was a QS release. It's the only way it was released. It had just a little tiny bit of information on the back there that said QS. You can see the little logo there in white. Otherwise, you'd never know it. It wasn't marked in any significant way. A great prog rock album. Getting into a little bit of Johnny Winter here with Still Alive and Well. This is an SQ or Columbia release. We also have his brother, Edgar Winter, and They Only Come Out at Night, which had the smash instrumental Frankenstein. It also had a free ride on this album. And then the follow-up album by Edgar Winter to that album was called Shock Treatment. It was a quad release as well. One of my other favorites from ABC, Joe Walsh. The smoker you get, the player you drink. I love the titles Joe Walsh used to pick for records. ABC Command Quadraphonic QS. This is an excellent sounding 4-channel record. Rick Wakeman from Yes. One of my favorites on the keyboard. It's an A&M release. This is a CD4. You see they put a big fat sticker. What A&M did is they had this quadraphonic banner around the record in blue, and then they would sticker what format they were using. Kind of different. And the Six Wives of Henry VIII here we have from Rick Wakeman as well. And this one I don't believe had a sticker on it. It was not mentioned whatsoever what the format was. This one was odd. I remember when it came out. And looking at it, it looks like a CD4 type record in this one, and not an SQ is what it looks like. So this one was one you had to kind of figure out on your own. Again, you had to have the right decoding equipment to do this. My Pioneer 949 has all three capabilities, SQ, QS, CD4. Very few receivers had that, or amplifiers. Usually you had to have separate decoders. So knowing what the record was important. And lastly, this is just a demonstration disc by Radio Shack. By Dynaco. Dynaco did this one. Dynaco used to build amplifiers and speakers and kits that you could build. And so this was a test record to make sure that you got the setup right on your stereo, like I had shown you earlier, related to the CD4 test disc that I had. So CD4 definitely had a technical nature to it. It had a more expensive nature to it. When it was set up right and everything worked, it was great. As a matter of fact, there were turntables specifically made for CD4 where the cartridge on it was CD4 and the cables that ran through it were low capacitance because it needed not noisy cables going through there because of that high carrier signal. Dual had a turntable called the 1229, and it also had a 1229Q, which was specifically made for CD4 to make sure that that low capacitance cable was run through the tone arm and into the actual body of that, and then the outputs in RCA were specific cables for low capacitance. So again, the CD4 world was really a bit of a technical nightmare in some ways and a little bit of a rabbit hole of cost, which of course didn't help make it become the format. Of course, in the end, none of them became the format. In the end, 4-channel was dying its own slow death, essentially, based on format wars. And it's unfortunate. These are kind of fun to have. Again, some of the mixes are a little different and they're a little bit unique. There are certain records like that Doors Best Of that was very unique and didn't exist in the market at all. It was the only way you could get it. So this particular technology came and went. I can still play it and enjoy it, which is more hearkening back to the day for me than anything else. Obviously, with today's technology and digital, you have all sorts of ways to get multi-channel, whether it's an SACD 5.1 or whether it's Blu-ray, and then you get into your 5.1 on it, your Dolby Digital or your Dolby Atmos for the most capability, where you actually can get sounds coming down from the ceiling with the setup there. So multi-channel has really grown and expanded well beyond this. As we know, with a record groove, you have the physical limitation of 2 sides that have to be dealt with, and that's all you have. So everything else that happened had to happen after the cartridge. It had to go into something to make this magic happen. And that's what it did. But again, it died a slow death of its own format wars, which never turn out good. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing this collection. I've been threatening to share this for a year or so, and I finally got around to it. If you have any questions about quad or anything else, I'd like to see them. As always, thanks for joining me, and subscribe if you can by pressing on the bell down there. And also a thumbs up is always nice to have for the algorithm. And comments, as I said, please write, ask questions. If you have some quad experience, let me know and share. It's always good to hear from those who have been in this club. There's many Facebook groups that I'm in that have to do with quad and multi-channel, and some really great people that I've met in there as well. So for now, thanks for joining me, and we'll catch you next time at our next Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. Take care, everybody.